Time for another board game review, and this time we have the game Imperial. This is sent to me by Rio Grande Games and is designed by Mac Gertz. International investors compete to exert the greatest influence in Europe with their wealth and granting of credit. They control the politics of the great European powers prior to World War I. The nations build factories, fleets, and armies. They expand, wage war, and levy taxes to pay the interest of their investors. Imperial is an event-packed strategy game independent of the luck of cards or dice. For 2 to 6 players age 13 and up. Let me show you how to play. So in Imperial, you are all international investors and you are trying to succeed in increasing your capital and gaining influence in the most powerful European nations. Play up to 6. Now, at the start of the game, each player receives a nations card. And this tells you how much bonds you have in those respective countries. So whoever gets the purple card gets 9 million in Russia and 2 million in France. Now, if you have less than 6 players, some of you may have 2 nation cards. Really what these are for is whoever has this card determines what that country does on that country's turn. The actions are determined by this rondelle. On the first turn of the game, you can pick any action, but let's say let's pretend Austria-Hungary had done an action. On Austria-Hungary's next turn, they can go up to 3 spaces forward for free, or that player who is moving it can pay 2 million to move for each space past it. So let's say Austria-Hungary wanted to do, for some reason, this production, let's say factory. They would have to pay 2 million because it's 1 space beyond the 3. The maximum move on the rondelle is 6 spaces. Now throughout this game, the nations are going to collect power points. And power points are calculated or kept track down here. If a nation hits 25 power points, that's when the game ends. The player's final score is they count up all their bonds and they calculate how much money they make off of them. So, as you see on this track, the further a nation moves along this track, they're worth more money at the end. So, if you're in the 10 to 14 range, you're going to have double your bonds. Triple your bonds up here, quadruple. If you get all the way to 25, the nation's bonds are worth 5 times their value at the end. A very important concept of this game is that each nation has its own treasury. So when you invest in a nation, you don't pay it to the bank, you pay it to that country because you're trying to invest in that country. You're not allowed to dispose of treasuries personally or lend or give away money. However, you can give personal cash to the treasury at any time to support it financially. You're also not allowed to lend or give money away to each other or trade bonds in any way. So let's go through the different actions you can do on the rondelle. Factory, the first one, is you can build 1 factory in that nation. So let's say, and also I forgot to say, turn order in this game, how it works is you start with Austria-Hungary and then you go clockwise. So then you go to Italy, France, UK, Russia, Germany. It's not based on player position, but on who controls or has the most bonds for each country. So let's say this player has, the $9 million in Austria-Hungary. They get to decide what Austria-Hungary does on this track up here. So let's say Austria-Hungary does factory. What factory does is they can build 1 factory. If you look on the board here, there are some spaces that are blue and some spaces that are brown. There are also some already existing factories, some for armaments and some for ships. To do the factory action, that nation pays $5 million to the bank from their treasury, and then they can build a factory in a region within that country, as long as they have the correct space. So let's say Austria-Hungary decides to build a shipyard in Trieste, right here. They pay $5 million to the bank, and that's the action. The production action, which is after, I'm just going to go through these all basically in order. The production action, that every facility and shipyard in the nation may produce 1 army or fleet, respectively, for free. Factories in a home province in which hostile armies are present cannot produce. So, let's say Italy wants to produce. If this were the case, they can just produce freely. So, 1 ship in Naples and 1 army unit in Rome. However, if, let's say, the UK had an enemy force in Rome, and they're hostile because they're standing up, then that means they can't produce there. The import action lets you spend money to buy military units. Each unit can be bought for $1 million each from that country's treasury, and you can build up to 3. You may place them in all home provinces that do not have hostile armies, and you can place them in the same province. Let's say France spends $3 million, and they decide to put some units in their country. So maybe they put a ship here, and let's say a unit here and here. Another action you can do is maneuvering. Maneuvering, you get to move all your units. First, you move fleets. All fleets are allowed to move to an adjacent sea region. If they're in the harbor, like let's say France does a maneuver, they start in the harbor like this, and then on their first move, they can move out to the adjacent water with the anchor from the harbor. From there, on a future turn, they could go, here, or even here, because those are all adjacent. But each maneuver move, you move 1 space. They could also move their units to different lands. Once you've moved all your ships, that's when you move your armies. Armies can actually be transported across ships. So let's say I had a ship in the Western Mediterranean Sea, like this. I could actually move my unit from here to Algeria, just hopping across the ship. Each fleet, however, may only transport 1 army per turn. So if I had 2 guys here, I couldn't use the same ship to send both. I could only send 1. If I had 2 ships in the harbor, then I could send 2 over. Every nation also has a railroad system inside the country. So basically, they can be transported before or after they move through the country at will. Let's say I had a unit here and I wanted to move up to Algeria. I could do that in 1 move because the railroad can take me here instantly, and then I cross the ship as a movement. Moving within your own country is allowed at free will. However, if there is a hostile army in your country, then you can't cross that space with railroads. Now, if your ships or armies enter a territory where another army's ships or armies are, you have to decide if you're going to battle or not. So let's say there was an Italian ship here, and this French ship moves in. If either side wants to fight, it's a 1-to-1 battle, and both get removed from the board. However, the invading fleet, visiting fleet, can decide if they don't want to battle, then they tip their ships over. As far as armies go, when you enter it's the same thing. If you enter a land with another person's army, you have to decide if it's going to be a fight or not. So in this case, if they fight, they would both be destroyed, or they can allow peace. Factories can be destroyed if you send 3 units to a factory's province. So let's say the UK sends 3 units here. They can spend those units to destroy this factory. If a nation only has 1 factory left, then that factory cannot be occupied by hostile armies or destroyed. And then finally, if an area contains only 1 army, then that region is assigned a flag of that country. So if France owns the West Mediterranean Sea, they place a flag here. You can also place flags in these other countries out here. However, you cannot place flags on country or provinces that belong to the other great powers. You can invade them and destroy their factories and occupy them, but you don't put flags on them. The next action is investor. Now, even if this space gets passed, stuff still happens. But if you land on investor, what happens is, first off, everyone who invested in that country gets paid money from the treasury based on how much their bonds are. So if one player has a 9 million, the other has a 2 million, they get the interest. In this case, 4 million and 1 million each. If there is not enough money in the treasury to pay everybody, the player who leads the government must turn down their interest completely or partly, and make sure everyone else gets paid. Then, regardless of whether it was landed on or passed by, this always happens. One of the players starts with an investor card. This investor card lets you, when investor is triggered, collect $2 million, and then you may do 1 investment. So that player can, let's say they go, I'm going to spend, if they had 12 million, they could spend 12 million And since they would have the most bonds in that country, because the other players only have 2 million and 9 million, they would seize control, and then they would get to do what decide what Austria-Hungary does. You can also upgrade your bond. If I already had the 9 million Austria-Hungary bond, I could spend 3 million more and just trade it in for this bond. Regardless, bonds are taken from the pile or returned to the pile and replaced, and that is what people can choose from. Once that player invests, they pass the token to their left, and that next person will get to invest on their turn. Or not their turn, when the investor phase is triggered again. If you do not have a control of any country, you get a Swiss bank. What the Swiss bank does is that you can invest, but you don't have to collect, but you don't collect 2 million from the bank. When the investor turn is done, you see who has the most bonds of each nation, and then you pass the nation cards accordingly if power changes. If someone has more bonds in Austria-Hungary than the current Austria-Hungary leader, then they get that flag and they control that country. And like I said, if you don't have a government, you get a Swiss bank. What the Swiss bank can do is they can force nations on the rondelle not to pass over an investor if its government intends to do so. However, this can only be done if the treasury of that nation has sufficient money to pay out all interest. So they can kind of force them to pay out for a certain country. And the final and perhaps most important action is taxation. How taxation works is you count how many factories that are unoccupied and how many flags you have in your country. So let's pretend that Austria-Hungary here has, let's give it 2 flags and it's got 3 factories. You get 2 million for each unoccupied factory, so 2, 4, 6, and 1 million for each flag, so 8 million. That Austria-Hungary would collect 8 million. Then on this tax chart over here, you mark where they're at. So 8 million goes up to here. That's plus 3 power points. So Austria-Hungary would then advance up to 3. However, once that's done, Austria-Hungary has to then pay money equal to their armies. So let's say they had, let's give them a ship and 2 cannons. Then in that case, they would have to pay 3 million for a net gain of 5 million. And that's pretty much the game. You're going around, controlling countries, making them, expand their territory, fight each other to claim more land, and then if you can, get rid of your armies so that you have to pay less taxes later. It's actually very insidious, but in a game, I guess it's kind of funny. And yeah, move troops around and import troops, build factories for more money and for more military growth. And yeah, every taxation round, grow their power points and try to get their bonds value higher as you go. Once you hit 25 with one nation, the game is done. And that's the game. So I'll be totally honest, I initially judged this game by its honestly hideous cover. The cover is just ugly as sin. It looked like it was going to be a super dry, boring, overly complicated Euro game, but actually it's not that hard to pick up, and it's pretty fun, although it is very mean, which I like. The rondelle system is nice and simple. You can move up to 3, but pay for more. Makes it so that, you don't overthink and go, okay, I mean, you should think, but you don't have to look at every single action because you might not even be able to afford all of them. Each action is relatively simple on its own, just kind of either producing troops, moving troops, scoring money, and so on. And even the combat is nice and simple. Just a 1-to-1, they blow up. You do get to make some interesting decisions because sometimes it may be best to skip a juicy action just so you can get to another one faster than another country, or maybe you don't necessarily want to pay out money to your opponents who are fellow investors, so you might, skip that investor spot. There's a lot of decisions to make in the flow of what different nations do. The fact that whoever has the most bonds value in a country controls what that country does that's a fun concept. I like that. You end up kind of wrestling for control and maybe sort of seizing it, like, aha, I have more bonds now. I control what this country does. I enjoy games where you kind of, collect bonds and, get shares of different countries and stuff. And this game is all about that. The whole theme of this game is you're all just a bunch of morally corrupt, manipulative bastards who are profiteering off of war, which is disgusting in real life, but in a board game, it's pretty fun. If you like these sort of, money games where you get to sort of, split up your bonds and get to be an evil tycoon and snatch power from people with evil capitalism, this one is actually very fun. I was really surprised by this. It looks dry, but it's not too hard to play actually, and there's a lot of sneaky money grubbing to do, which I enjoy.